All right, everybody, how you doing? It's Friday, November 10th. Oh my gosh, we made it. It's Veterans Day here in the United States. Remembrance Sunday, Armistice Day, big weekend, saluting our veterans. So we should say thank you to all them, and we should say thank you to Gerald Ashley for joining us again. Gerald, how's it going? What's happening, my friend?
Um, yeah, I'm well, and as you can see, I've got a poppy on, which is a sort of traditional, sort of charitable sort of thing we do every year for retired soldiers, sailor and airmen, and particularly to remember its roots really go back to the remembrance of the First World War, and it's a big thing on Sunday with a um, ceremony with the royal family. This year, obviously, it will be the King. Although he's done it for the last few years because the late Queen was really not well enough to spend that amount of time at the ceremony. Anyhow, this is normally a completely non contentious thing. It's very much in the sort of British calendar every year, but I'm afraid it has got a bit hijacked by various protesters, particularly about the situation in Israel and Palestine, Gaza, and all the rest of it. Now, we shall see if there are any disturbances on Sunday, but I think the vast majority of Britain would be horror struck if there were. But we wait to see. Um, on a lighter note, tomorrow is when we have a new Lord Mayor in London, which is a new one every year. I'm going to get the number wrong. I'm going to guess the number. I know it's in the, I think it's in the 690s. I think it's 695. It's a particular interest to me because a personal friend of mine becomes Lord Mayor, but that won't, a gentleman called Michael Manelli, but that won't actually confer any great advantages or gifts flowing my way. It's not like medieval times, obviously.
Will you be able to park illegally then and get out of tickets, or does it have any cachet
No,
whatsoever?
I do, and this is slightly bizarre, but it is true. I am a freeman of the City of London, so I can drive my sheep across London Bridge should I wish to.
What a country! Oh my gosh! All right, uh, I don't have a good segue for that, but yeah, I should actually say the Veterans Day is obviously tomorrow, the 11th here in the States, but the federal holiday is today. Yeah, it's going to be an interesting weekend as well. A lot of big protests last weekend here in Washington, D.C., and really something I've never seen, even going back to the Black Lives Matter marches in the 20s. I don't know. There's a lot of angst, a lot of energy on both sides. It's quite interesting, and the culmination of this around this important holiday is quite interesting. And that's a good segue. Before we came on the pod, I mean, obviously, what's happening in the Middle East, Ukraine, Taiwan, even I would say Sudan. I don't know if you're paying attention to what's happening down there, but some horrible atrocities this week. I don't know. There's something percolating. There's something in the water. There's something happening. It doesn't feel good. It just feels like things are itching about.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, not to trivialize all of this, but if you were to try and create a Venn diagram of all these issues and how they sort of overlap and fold into one another, I think they seem to be getting closer. And all sorts of interesting bilateral arrangements are going on. Taiwan is making a big series of efforts really to try and make new friends or to strengthen friendships. I see they've got some defense and defense equipment pact with the Czech Republic of all people. Though I think it's true to say, for reasons I don't know, the Czechs have always been quite favourable towards Taiwan. It's not a leap of imagination to see those weapons ending up in Ukraine and the uproar that would follow if Taiwanese kit and equipment, okay, be labeled in a different way, found its way onto the battlefield in the Ukraine. The other area, if we're not already worried about the Middle East and Taiwan and Ukraine, and I suppose it is sort of um, linked to it, is what's going on in the Baltic. And I know we talked about the Baltic many times before, back when we first started some 2 years ago. I think it was our first topic. So maybe we come back to the Baltic states in a little bit. But if you you have a job where all these problems slide across your desk, well, that's, I guess, the President of the United States of America. To me, a lot of this feels much more joined up. I don't mean in a nice way, but it just seems much more interlinked than maybe even 6 months or certainly a year ago. Whether that just all fizzles out and isn't some big catastrophe, I think that's probably will be the case. But it does feel extremely worrying at the moment.
Yeah, I think what's yeah, we definitely need to talk about Sweden. I think what's interesting, once you have a country who's been, not allied with anybody for 200 years, suddenly joins up, the NATO treaty alliance. That's pretty telling. I think what's also what I've been watching, what's going on as well is next week, Xi and Biden are due to meet on the sidelines of the Asia Pacific Economic Conference in San Francisco on the 15th. It'll be the second time they've met in person since Biden's been president. And there's been all this buzz coming out of Beijing that, hey, we want to be friends again. We want to open up to the West. We want investment. Odd behavior, like suddenly this pivot. And what's also been odd to me is like our friend Vladimir Putin, nowhere to be found. Not on the front pages, not creating buzz. He seems to be enjoying this. He's got. I can't think that Hamas didn't suddenly happen without some kind of outside encouragement, whether it be from Tehran or Moscow. But I don't think things happen randomly in the world. I think there was some kind of encouragement. And then I think about going into 24 elections, obviously in the U.S., but also the UK, right? And I think there's 30 or 40 other countries are having elections, including Russia. I don't know. This all seems to play into Russians' hands right now. This kind of standstill, landlocked ground, no movement whatsoever. These kind of standstill conflicts, certainly distracting to the West. It's serving a lot of time in London, Paris, Washington, D.C., etc. And is Putin this master strategist, or is this just a fait accompli? I mean, there does seem to be Russia does seem to have the upper hand right now, causing all these weird conflicts around the world.
Yeah, I think the other thing is, of course, we're all prisoners of the global media machine that really seems to only able to focus on one or a maximum of two things at any one time. And so, Ukraine has completely disappeared from a lot of, certainly British television news. It barely gets a mention, given that they used to have embedded reporters and it used to lead the news night after night for many months, and that's faded away. I would have thought Zelensky in Ukraine must be quite concerned about the political atmosphere now, because the summer has gone, the summer offensive has gone. The weather is not going to be conducive to anything very much happening for either side in Ukraine. And as you say, that kind of suits the Russians, I suppose. And then come the spring, will the political temperature be in Washington somewhat not quite so warm towards Ukraine? And, will it be so easy to pass more bills or executive orders to get more armaments and cash flowing to them? Who knows? But I would have thought the Ukrainians are not in a good position, and their risk is that some of the G7 countries start talking about cutting a deal with Putin.
Yeah, I think it's interesting politically here in the States. Chris Christie is running for president. I mean, he's not going to be elected, but he is going to Israel this weekend, right? I think that's telling. He's not going to Ukraine to, show his foreign policy bona fides. Biden meeting with Xi next week. There's much more buzz here in Washington, D.C. that China is the real enemy. China's the one we have to watch, etc. That Ukraine's really a European problem. Funding is slowing down, right? There's the government here in the U.S. may shut down again, which will cause all kinds of problems. There's no going into an election year. There's hardly any appetite for spending a lot of money, and the Republicans, seem to be losing interest in Ukraine. They see this as a European problem. So I think you're spot on, and I think what's going to be I'm really for next week. I'm really interested to see how much energy comes out of this Biden-Xi meeting. I know, obviously, going back to Nixon, the great dream of peeling away the Chinese from Moscow was really the goal there. I don't know. Are we seeing a flashback to Nixon in the 70s, bringing Beijing back into the fold, back into the family of family of friends.
I wouldn't have thought so. I think they're still viewed with very strong suspicion. But one interesting little fact that came out this week, which I thought was interesting, was that the big hot tech stock, Nvidia, that makes all sorts of fancy high tech, very high end microchips and all that goes with it, um, are producing three new products that are aimed at the Chinese market. And they're very careful to state that that's very much within the rules of the game as set by the US Department of Commerce about not giving away vital technology and all the rest of it. But I thought that was quite interesting that suddenly they're pointing back that way.
Well, even this week, Janet Yellen, in advance of the Xi Biden meeting, met with her counterpart and said, we're not going to decouple. So, all this like idea that we're going to go solo, or the idea as a capitalist society that we're not interested in selling microprocessors, automobiles, coffee, hotel rooms to Chinese communists is being quickly extinguished. I mean, it's such a big market. There's such a big interest. There's so much pressure, obviously, from the traders in London and on Wall Street to have these multinationals compete in that market. And, if the UK and US businesses leave, the French are happy to replace that, so are the Germans, et cetera. So that, once again, it's an interesting, situation where the reality of the world is we got to find a way to work with these people.
Yeah, it's our old friend Realpolitik, absolutely, isn't it? And of course, we continue to see on the sidelines, and which gets tiny coverage really, endless little bilateral deals going on all the time. So you and I have focused or tried to focus people's attention on how Japan is very much in the defense fold. I thought only a small announcement, but quite interesting, that the UK and Poland are now going to share some air defense pact, which I think is a nice way of saying that we're going to send more sort of anti-aircraft equipment, radar, high-end missiles and all the rest of it. But again, it just shows the way that there are lots of bilateral stuff going on. I suppose that will be under the umbrella of NATO, but I think it's telling that these things are happening.
It does seem, to use a UK expression, that the government, the bureaucrats, if you will, are on the front foot. Like they're really driving kind of the agenda. I've been really quite surprised that multinational CEOs, business in general, hasn't taken a step back. I think it's interesting you brought up the Nvidia situation, because that is to me like saying, hey, we got to find a way to work, business kind of stepping forward. Yeah, we'll play by the US rules, but we're not going to ignore this market. That's kind of an interesting thing. I wonder if business, if you will, is more pushing forward, if they were more driving the agenda, if we wouldn't have all these, I don't know, crazy situations. Or
I think something else that's going on in business, and this will please some people and upset others, is I think there's a bit of rowing back from a lot of all this stuff about societal purpose and ESG and how important, the principles of what you're doing in business is shot through every product you do. I see that Unilever are sort of steering away from some of the more sort of, dare one say, woke ideas that they were promoting. We're seeing Shell saying actually they're going to up their spending on, funnily enough, oil and gas. Of course they are. But it's quite interesting that what was a big fashion thing 2, 3, 4 years ago may be fading a little bit. Now, some people may be disappointed by that, others won't be. But I think maybe it's just the hard realities of commerce and the world out there, are getting in the way of some of these fanciful ideas.
Yeah, there's a term, like people have been calling them luxury beliefs. That is, like, you have the affordability or the luxury, the richness to be able to pursue these, ulterior motives, which are all sudden good. But as we, Milton Friedman, the business of the business is a business, right? It's not to solve all the world's problems. That's why we have governments. That's quite interesting. I wonder too, the backlash. I've been thinking about the UAW strike here in the US, the Hollywood strike, inflation. A was telling somebody you can't really leave the house without spending $100. I mean, I don't know the last time you bought a sandwich, but when you go to buy a sandwich and you drop $25, you're like, how is that possible? I just came here for a sandwich and a bag of chips, and it's $25.
Yeah, no,
so the inflation number is quite interesting as well.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt that's the case, which may be just an opportunity to talk a little bit about money rather than World War III all the time. The old joke that if you ask 3 economists, you get 4 answers. So anything that is said about this area is always a bit fraught. But a number of people are focusing on money supply data in the UK, Europe, and also United States. Most people sort of fall asleep when you sort of talk about this, but there is quite an intellectual battle going on. And the intellectual battle now is, are the monetarists getting back on top in terms of the argument? They argued for a long time that all the big expansion of the money supply would lead to inflation, which of course it has done. Some people would argue it was other things rather than just the money supply. And now a lot of these guys are arguing that the money supply is, well, if you want to be tabloid, some people would say free fall. I think that's kind of overdoing it rather a lot, but certainly the money supply looks to be contracting. And that is nearly always a sign of a bad recession, not just a little recession, a really bad one. Now, I always think of you when people talk about recessions, because you keep pointing out that people keep predicting recessions that never ever actually happen. And
this has been the greatest pre-recession recession I've ever lived through.
That is your great quote, isn't it? And we got to the stage in data actually out today in the UK where the economy is absolutely flatlining, literally at 0%. And so one half of the world is screaming that we're falling off a cliff, and the other half is saying we're not doing too badly given what's going on and all the rest of it. So why is all this important other than just, the value of money and prices and everything? It folds back into your comment, 2024 is the big election year. And, people are going to be very focused on inflation, or they're going to be very focused on whether they've got a job, whether they can afford housing and all the rest of it. And none of the stuff that seems to be coming out is going to be very favorable to incumbent governments, I don't think. It's hard to defend if you're the incumbent government.
Yeah, like Biden's been running out this idea of Bidenomics, and sure, they passed some massive bills, long-term investment, and all kinds of infrastructure projects, but those take 5, 10, 15 years to come online. And I think, this money supply idea, and we're talking about like the velocity of money, and I guess like what I'm hearing from you is like how the money's being used, right? Am I using cash that can be invested, or am I using cash because I got to pay because stuff's more expensive, right? Is that like what we really should be thinking about when we hear the term money supply?
Yeah, I think that's right. And the other thing that gets lost in all this sort of arcane language and everything is business investment, which has been a bane in the UK economy for very, very many years. Even back pre the global financial crisis, people complained that British companies weren't reinvesting enough, and the counter argument was, well, there wasn't the incentive to do it, and so forth. But it's very hard to see where the good outcome is in all of this. The good outcome is economic growth. That is the get out of jail card. If you can grow your economy, suddenly debts become less of a worry. It's pretty much the same as if you're at a personal level. If you have a genuine pay rise, or you go to another job that pays better and better status and perks and all the rest of it. But the simple fact is most G7 economies are going sideways. And unfortunately, one or two of them are on the edge of going south. One we shouldn't forget in all of this is Germany. I mean, the situation in Germany is really quite extraordinary because of their sort of government policy decisions on energy. Their manufacturing base is being absolutely crucified. And, the German economy is shrinking. And this is is not good news for anybody because people want to sell the stuff to Germany and buy from them and all the rest of it. But it's quite remarkable that this locomotive of the European economy through thick and thin is now, I think, in some, difficult times to say the least.
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any certainly short-term fix. One of the numbers I like to look at are people planning for vacations. Do they have confidence that even buying washers and dryers, those kind of white goods, I think is an interesting economic issue I like to watch. What's interesting, we've been chatting a lot about EVs, and the EV news around electric vehicles has been quite dire. Like nobody's buying these things, and I'm wondering, are they nobody buying them because they don't like them, or nobody buying them because they can't afford them, or they don't have the economic confidence? Like people are saying, I'm going to drive this car longer. It's probably a combination of all three things. And how do you stimulate the economy is always the great unknown, right? I mean, bureaucrats think they know how to do it.
Well, again,
but we're definitely seeing a sluggish economy everywhere.
There's an intellectual divide here, isn't there? Because some people say you need the government to stimulate parts of an economy to get it going. And then there are other people on the other side of the fence who say, actually, the main problem is government, get them out of the way. And, the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, like a lot of these things. But there is no growth in large parts of the world, and we're very indebted. And so the only get out of jail card otherwise is inflation. So whilst politicians and policymakers bemoan inflation, in one way it's quite useful because it's a way of washing down the debt a bit. But there's a lot of debt out there still, and of course it affects all of us at a personal level. And as you say, I bought a round of drinks, 3 pints of beer. I don't know when you were last in England, you thought a pint of beer was. 3 pints of beer came to the princely sum of £19, which, I mean, it's just astonishing. It's just astonishing. And these stories are all over the place. And of course, energy prices are up. So all of this folds into the politics of 2024. Without all the foreign stuff, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah, and I think in the short term, I mean, I can't, I don't know. I think like usually going into elections, especially here in the States, nobody really wants to do anything, right? So I can't see any kind of certainly fiscal policy. I can't see the Fed doing anything. I can't see any kind of monetary policy. I can't see any tax policy happening. I don't know. So I think like 24 could be sluggish as well.
Yeah.
And, until we get new leadership or kind of new administrations, I don't know. That's not very exciting.
It all does look very stuck, doesn't it? I kind of steered us away from the geopolitics, and perhaps we should just, having depressed everybody about finance, we'll just go quickly back to geopolitics.
Well, before we get off the finance, I mean, that great phrase, this is new, or this time it's different, or I don't know. Is it different? Is it because we have so much debt? I mean, why are we in this situation? Is it because is it cyclical, or do you really have, I mean, what's your sense of why the economy is where it is?
I think it's because, and this is a personal view, I think in many economies, the state is taking on too much of the activity, and that's expensive. And so in the UK, we have the highest levels of taxation since 1945, but not very conducive to getting people moving. We also, and this may be slightly more contentious, have a huge number of people who are doing rather nicely out of not doing much work in the public sector, or not doing any work at all and are living on benefits. Now, this is always a landmine because people get very upset when you say about people being on benefits, but some of the numbers are quite extraordinary. There's something like over 5 million people in the UK who are so-called economically inactive, but they're in receipt of benefits. Now, there comes a point where the state can't afford that. And so maybe there are some, if you like, something's going to have to give here somewhere at some point. But politicians have no interest in facing up to these big things. Mr. Sunak came out with another tiny idea this week, which is something to do with banning pedal tricycles for tourists in London or something insane. I mean, this is hardly, this is hardly in the sort of nature of, Churchill or Lloyd George or Disraeli, is it? I mean, this is penny packet. It's not even penny packet stuff. It's just nonsense. But I think it's because the big stuff is too hard.
Well, that is I need to find that story. I mean, why would the PM even know about such devices? But unbelievable. All right, where should we pivot to? I think.
Well, I
want to say something. Getting back to the Biden-Xi meeting, coming out of 2008 recession, China opened the floodgates. I don't know. Is this China's time? If Xi were to say to Biden, "Hey, I'll invest $1 billion in the U.S." Hey, Rishi Sunak, I'll invest $1 billion in the UK. Be hard pressed to say no to that kind of stuff. I don't know. It's gonna be interesting to see what happens.
Well, I think, and it's always comparisons are odious, as the old phrase goes. But I often think when one looks at China, one's looking at Japan in the 1980s, where you had tremendous growth. Everything was go. They were buying up everything right, left, and center. America was outraged when they bought the Rockefeller Center and
they bought Pebble Beach. Yeah, unbelievable.
All this kind of type of stuff. And China's had that phase, and then of course there was a big bubble that burst in Japan. Now the Chinese government have got much more control over the economy than the Japanese government ever did, and I think that's what they're struggling against. And so, in a way, they're in the same boat as the rest of us. They're trying to stimulate growth, and their big problem is funny enough, is their population. In that, we've grown up, all of us, with the idea that China is huge and getting bigger all the time in terms of population. Well, now it's not. The demographics are turning a little bit. And of course, that doesn't mean it shrinks overnight, but it does mean they're going to have a large number of elderly population, certainly over the next 20 or 30 years. And that's just going to make life harder for them as well. So
yeah, there's a great saying, will China get gray, right, before it gets rich? And the demographics suggest that's the case, but they're sitting on a lot of cash. That's also, I think about Apple. I saw some crazy stat too, like Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's enterprise, over $150 billion in cash. I mean, seriously? I mean, should that... money supply. Shouldn't that money be put to work? I mean, even if you took, 10% of that and just dropped it into some projects. I mean, some moonshot projects. That's bizarre to me too. The amount of cash corporates are sitting on is pretty wild.
This is the almost ultimate version of Brewster's Millions, isn't it? You've got just, and who knows? One thing which I did want to just quickly pull back on, and it's just an interesting sidelight on the state of the world, is Sweden. There was a report in the Times over here this week quoting a guy called Henrik. I've got to get his name right here.
No, I've got it here in front of me. I read the article myself. Yeah, Henrik Enholm.
Louderholm, I think.
Louderholm, sorry, yeah. Henrik Louderholm.
He's the security advisor to the Prime Minister of Sweden, and he's come out with an astonishing statement, and also making it public, saying that Sweden faces the greatest dangers since the end of the Second World War. Bear in mind, they were neutral in the Second World War, but they had to play their cards very carefully because they were huge iron ore suppliers to Germany during the Second World War. And people can criticize them for that, but I don't think they had much choice in doing the deals, to be honest. And he's listed Russia, a lot of trouble with extremism in parts of the immigrant community in Sweden, and a sort of general feeling that the whole country is sort of very listless and they're not unhappy is the wrong sort of phrase to use, but there's a lot of anxiety about the future of the country.
Yeah, you also mentioned armed cartels battling for supremacy over drugs, which I thought was quite. Yeah, I mean that is a hell of a statement. And before we hit record here, as you know, Sweden, independent for 200 years, suddenly decides to join up with NATO. And I randomly ran into this Swedish guy at a bar a few weeks ago, and when the Ukraine war, the second, the serious invasion started, he was telling me how people in Stockholm were stockpiling food. Like they thought it was like game on, like they're coming for us next. And I was quite taken aback because I don't have that kind of anxiety, but I was like, if that's permeating in Stockholm and throughout Sweden, that's got to be spreading to other capitals in Europe. This kind of dread, this kind of anxiety, this kind of like, this isn't a normal situation. Pretty wild. And for him to have this statement, I don't think you can sweep this under the rug. This to me seems like a big freaking deal.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And I think, again, it's often interesting to watch people's actions rather than their words. And certainly the actions in both Poland and Finland, Finland also now joining NATO, over the last 5 or 10 years has been massive military spending. I mean, Poles now have a very strong military, more so than Germany, which is rather weakened to say the least. And Finland also a very strong military. And I can't see anything but people like Sweden starting to rearm quite quickly, because you say they're front and center of lots of different things here.
Well, also, I'm really interested in obviously the human behavior, the psychology of this. And as we talked about a few weeks ago, going into conflict or thinking about conflict, does it become so pervasive that it just like clouds your thinking and, you like talk yourself into this stuff. If you start seeing threats everywhere, you hope this guy's sober. I assume he is. But, I'm interested in the psychology of this. I mean, this to me seems pretty aggressive and pretty shocking.
Yeah, and I think Sweden in particular, that's had this very sort of quite liberal, free way of thinking since the war, and over the last 10 or 15 years, that started to unravel a bit, and now it's obviously starting to feel really serious. And it'll be interesting to see what policy moves they make. But it all plays to this thing that maybe Western Europe, to an extent, has had a free lunch over things like defense in the past. I know this was one of Donald Trump's great things about that we weren't paying enough for defense. And we're going to have a quick mention of him this week because I see in some of the swing polls, he's suddenly starting to look an interesting situation. And it's not beyond the bounds of possibility. I suppose he could win next year. And I think that could be serious news for Western Europe, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about Sweden, I just think about it's tough to escape human behavior, and we've been living on this planet for a number of years, and it always seems to come back. We try, I don't know, maybe we try new things, and also I think what's interesting about what this gentleman is talking about is also the hybrid nature of it. You could have all this bells and toys and standing army, but disinformation, the asymmetry, terrorism, drug cartels. I mean, these are hard things to stop with a battleship, and then getting back to Trump. Yeah, on Sunday, earlier in the week, poll came out that Trump was ahead over Biden in five of six key battleground states. So obviously the Democrats, as they do, freaking out, pearl clutching, crying, and huge boost for Trump. You'd have to think if the election was held today, Trump probably wins. Biden's numbers are atrocious, 37% job approval. Nobody really, I was listening to this comedian the other day, and he was like, listen, Trump sells merch. He sells T-shirts and hats. Nobody's really wearing a Biden hat. Like, there's just lacking like that energy and that excitement. I have to say, anybody who is paying attention has to assume Trump has an amazing chance to get reelected, and frankly should be planning for him to be taking the oath of office in 2025. If Biden does win, it's going to be a tight race. But yeah, there's an amazing chance that Trump gets back to the White House, and oh my gosh, put on your helmet. It's going to be a bumpy ride because he actually knows the job now, and I think it's going to be quite terrifying. But quite seriously, I think you can't dismiss him not getting back in there, even with all the shenanigans and the criminal indictments. And yeah, there's a lot of anxiety around the Trumpster.
And this is all basically almost in exactly a year's time. So we've got
No,
this
it
all
was just
coming up.
under a year. Yeah, no, exactly. So as we're meeting next year for Veterans Day, I don't know. We may be trying to find the escape hatch, and I don't know. Maybe we'll get into shepherding. I'll take you up on that sheep herding job and start moving sheep across the London Bridge. You best not lose that license.
It's starting to appeal.
That may be the best outcome. That may be the best job you've ever described in your life.
Now, have we depressed everybody sufficiently, or are there any other topics we can depress people?
No, I think there's nothing else we can add to this cauldron of depression. Oh my gosh. Let's talk about something fun. What we're reading and watching. Hopefully you're not reading about the 200-year conflict or something.
No, I'm not inflicting history books on people this week for a change. Watching, first of all, and for me, it's become a sort of November, December sort of fixture to watch. It's a very popular BBC cookery program. It's a bit more than cookery. I think it's haute cuisine, called MasterChef. And this is a series that has gone through a number of iterations over the years. I think it's probably from its earliest days, about 20 years ago, maybe even more. And I think it's, why am I sitting down for an hour watching, 6 people or 8 in some cases, sort of sweating away in the kitchen and having disasters and triumphs, and often a lot of slightly highfalutin language about how important various vegetables I've never heard of before are being cooked. But it is quite gripping, and it's particularly well produced, and I guess I, with a lot of other people, are watching it. It's on 3 days a week for about 6 weeks, and it's probably recorded ages ago, but they seem to keep the result very quiet. So I wouldn't say the whole of the nation's watching, but it's certainly a very popular show, and in a world where big TV audiences have melted away these days because everybody's on YouTube, TikTok, and Lord knows what else. It's rare that you get something where you pull a lot of people in to watch a show or a series like that. So I would recommend to people who access the BBC one way or another. It's a pretty good show, and you also pick up some cookery tips if you're at that level of cooking, to be honest.
I love one of my favorite escape shows is Can't Beat Bobby Flay. He's a chef here, Food Network, and I don't know, great British baking show. There's something about watching people cook that I find immensely entertaining, and educational and interesting.
There is actually a really good play by Arnold Wesker called The Kitchen, which is set in a kitchen of a large restaurant, and that is an exceptionally good play. It's not been on. It's about 30 years old, and it's not been on in London now for about 10 or 15 years. But it comes around now and again. And again, if anybody anywhere in the world gets a chance to see a play called The Kitchen by Arnold Wesker, it's well worth it.
Have you ever worked in a restaurant,
Joe? No, I haven't. No. I know. I've always been the other side, which is the best side to be.
I've worked in several restaurants. Yeah, in my teenage, I don't know, early 20s, and I don't know. It's a great melting pot. I have an affinity for people that work in restaurants. It's quite a cauldron of craziness, and it's quite an interesting venue for stuff.
Yeah,
for life,
and it's also a good introduction to the foibles of the great, in your case, the great US public, as what they're really like, which you don't really necessarily, until you start serving people, you don't really realize, I guess.
Well, serving and also working with kitchen, guys just came out of jail, it's a pretty wild democratic, can you wash pans? Sure. Here's a job, start washing pans and work your way up. And then, just the marketing of it, taking food. Yeah. But working with people, there's nothing like it.
it seems quite a brutal environment when you get towards the top. I think it's quite,
It's an insane way to make a living. I mean, it's a lot of work.
yeah, it's a lot of work. Right, onto a book. Another one off a bookshelf. This is from '08. I read it at the time. It was yet another birthday or Christmas present. Great title. It's called Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me. And this is the whole idea of how we sort of post rationalize our bad decisions, blame everybody else, blame everything except oneself, basically. It's written by two psychologists, sort of social scientists, Carol Tavris and Elliot Aronson, Americans, California. Um, Great sort of um, analysis of how decisions go wrong, how everybody sort of is very good at pointing at everybody else, and how we do it subliminally, how we kind of slightly reinterpret past facts, not necessarily embellish them or deliberately make things make ourselves look better, but we're set up, and this will appeal to you, Mark. We are set up to be optimistic, and so we have a tendency to see the best in ourselves, in particular, and to believe that everything will kind of be okay in the end. Now, this has got a slightly Disney feel to it, if you believe that. That's not the theme of the book. The book is about, look, we've got to stop fooling ourselves, and as we know, it's very difficult and hard to go over past mistakes. But that's, of course, where the lessons of the future are, is that you really learn from your mistakes. We always say that, but we don't necessarily want to do it. So it's quite a it's not a heavy read, but it's quite a detailed book. And if people have an academic bent, it's all reference and all the rest of it. But it's a sort of book you could read on a plane or a train as well. And I
Are
agree.
you trying to send me? Are you trying to send me a message, Gerald? Did my
No,
therapist? Did my therapist talk to you?
no. If I was sending you a message, I'd be sending you an invoice as well.
Well, as I told somebody this week, any idiot can send an invoice. It's getting them to pay.
Ah, yes. Yeah.
Well, I will. I'm reading a great book. It's called The Swerve. It's by Stephen Greenblatt. It's about this poem that was written in 1417 on the nature of things. And it really opened up essentially how to think scientifically. Obviously, the church was quite in control at the time, but it was pre-Martin Luther. I mean, this is like obviously 1417, but it really looks at like life, science, and it's written as like a page turner. You know, it is historical, but it's written like a novel, and it's quite a fascinating read. It has all the great characters from Florence, the Renaissance. Won a Pulitzer Prize back in the day, but it's been a great book. It's been really interesting. And
so this is this big opening up of the Renaissance and all the rest of it.
Exactly. And this, this kind of undiscovered, not really well known, what do I want to say? Like, it was written in a monastery. It was kind of lost, and it was discovered. It's got a kind of Dan Brown history, Indiana Jones kind of theme to it. And I don't know, it's really changed the way humans have thought for the last, 800, 600 years. So
this sounds
quite
like
interesting.
This sounds like one for the Christmas reading list. It sounds a very good one. Very good.
Yeah, it's I don't know how I came across it, but it's been really great, fun to read, historical. It's got me thinking, etc. I last night went to see Warren Miller's latest film, and if you don't know Warren Miller, he's since passed, but he essentially was from Southern California, joined the U.S. Navy, was a surfer, was interested in photography, and he fell in love with skiing. And in '46, he bought a camera, and he started filming people skiing. And he's since gone on to make 50 plus films. You make a film every year. He's really the first kind of creative entrepreneur, built this whole lifestyle around skiing. And he's an ambassador to the sport. And these films now have gotten quite exotic. They go to Greenland, Norway, Chile, and they film some of the most exotic places and the most intense skiers, but it's also kind of like just the fun lifestyle, the goofiness of skiing, going to resorts, people sliding all over, the whole après ski. But these are great films. They're a lot of fun. To me, they show them in October, November, kind of kick off the ski season. And, it's a good reminder that I should have been a ski bum, but I decided to show up today. But they're a lot of fun, and they're out there. They're good escape films. And I think Warren, what's interesting is he really created this business around adventure film and, adventure sport and putting these amazing athletes on film and creating this whole lifestyle and entrepreneurship, and pretty amazing.
Sounds good. Sounds very good.
There are all these guys. It's interesting that the American ski industry really took its start after World War II, because these guys had gone over to Europe, especially at the 10th mountain. They trained and they, learned about the Alps and all this stuff. And they were like, hey, this is pretty cool. So they came back to Colorado, Idaho, Montana, and set up these ski resorts in California, et cetera. And I don't know. We have a lot to thank to, speaking of veterans, this is a good kind of full circle. Yeah. Here's a guy who served, and all these other, really the first guys who started American skiing, as we think of it today, really got the roots out of World War II. So
interesting. Very interesting. Sounds good.
Good stuff. We should have been a ski bum. Have you ever thought about being a ski bum, Gerald?
No, I spent 3 years in Switzerland, and I only ever, and this will not surprise anybody, the only time I ever went up a mountain was to go to a restaurant.
Wow. Après ski, man. There's nothing better than après ski. I mean, it's a good lifestyle. The whole lifestyle is great.
There are some fantastic restaurants up mountains in the Alps, including one from the James Bond film. I think it's on His Majesty's or on Her Majesty's Secret Service. And the worst part about them is the eye-watering cost of the ski pass to get to the top of the mountain. To get on the, to get to the restaurant the restaurant's the cheap part, which is not normally the case in Switzerland. So there we are.
Yeah, it's decidedly not a man of the people sport. That is for sure.
No, absolutely
you have to have a few bucks in your pocket. So money supply. Hopefully, the money supply will go to the ski industry this winter.
Well, so long as the supply comes our way, that's the key thing, isn't it?
All right, everybody. Gerald, thanks a lot. Good chatting with you. This is the Ructions podcast. We'll be back in a few weeks. Stay positive. Things are sometime in the future, and we'll get better. Less stressful.
Things can only get better. That's what you're trying to say.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.